If you've ever looked at ancient Greek art or know anything about the history, you may have noticed it looks a bit, well, fruity. A bit gay. And boy do I have some gay history to tell you today. Because if same-sex love was sacred to the Greeks, what the hell happened to us? But first we need to get some things straight. Well, not straight, but you get what I mean, right? Ancient Greece wasn't one big thing. It's just a convenient name we use for a collection of mostly independent city-states. They all had different traditions, so not everything in this story applies to all of them. Thebes was not the same as Sparta, which wasn't the same as Athens. And I'll highlight when something applies more to one than the other. That aside, generally we can find a lot of evidence that the Greeks were very, very gay. But they would refer to it as eros. Eros meant something deeper. The pull between bodies and souls, a divine, sometimes dangerous form of attraction. In Sparta, wildlings that they were, they baked eros into their warrior culture. Older men would abduct boys and show them the rope. The idea is that these were strictly non-sexual relationships, but they could be a bit erotic. Whereas, over in Elis or Thespiae, they had sanctuaries of eros, inscriptions that celebrate love between men. Love was not just tolerated, but sacred. Temples, inscriptions, and festivals marked it out as a civic good. So yeah, depending on where you were, what you mean, the Greeks were pretty gay. But it wasn't just about pleasure. It was a part of civic life, love, and even warfare. Something that later got erased. And one story in particular can show you just how deeply gay they could be. If you're old, like me, you may remember a certain thing called Don't Ask, Don't Tell from the US military. They compromised that if you didn't tell anyone that you were gay, you were allowed to be in the military. A very flawed system. But in ancient Greece, we have a fantastic, long-lost story that shows us the complete opposite side of this. This is the Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite 300-man army. Not that 300. They were created to guarantee absolute loyalty. In 375 BC, they were out on patrol, expecting some minor battles. Instead, in classic strategy video game style, they bump into a much larger force of Spartans they weren't expecting. Yeah, those of 300 fame. They are considered to be invincible. The Thebans are outnumbered by at least 3-1, with the lower estimate being 1,000 Spartans, outnumbered and weaker. Their leader Pelopidas should try to escape, but he has another idea. He lines the sacred band up into a tight phalanx, and charges into the Spartans. I apologize, I couldn't resist using the phallus joke there. On with the video. The imaginary crowd goes wild, and the sacred band wins. This shattered the idea of the Spartans being so tough. And here's the really interesting thing that you may have already guessed. The unit within the band were groups of two men. Partners even. Yes, they were gay lovers. They believed that lovers would rather die than let their partners fall, and that this bond made them more courageous than any oath or command. It wasn't just a ragtag bunch of gays forming an army either. The city demanded its existence. And as we've seen, it worked. However, in 338 BC, they took on Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's daddy. And sadly for our queer heroes, they were beaten and many died. And somewhere along the way, we forgot they ever existed. And this man, Xenophon, is the reason for this. He was a Spartan historian. And instead of acknowledging that a bunch of gays beat his people fair and square, he just referred to them as chosen men. So it took thousands of years to piece the puzzle together. Over 2,000 years later, in 1880, archaeologist Panagiotis Stamatakis found 254 skeletons, almost lying in battle formation. And from there, we began to solve the puzzle. Sometimes, history is written by the losers, and they are petty. But before we get too misty-eyed, not every Greek was waving rainbow flags, especially in Athens. But here's where it gets weird. You could love a boy, sure, but act like a girl, be too soft, too passive, that could ruin you. Athens gives us one of the clearest and most complicated pictures of Greek sexuality. The most famous model is called pederasty, a relationship between an older man and an adolescent boy. It was supposed to be about mentorship, guidance, and yeah, sometimes sex. This is the version you'll see on a lot of pottery. Bearded older men with younger men. often in intimate scenes. But here's where it gets complicated. Some pottery shows something different. Two men, both equals, not teacher and student, just lovers. So which was it? Modern scholarship often claims Greek pederasty was always about older men and boys. But as James Davidson points out, that's a myth, a simplification. In reality, the Greeks didn't follow one model. Every city had its own rules, expectations, and taboos. In Athens, specifically, things were strict. It wasn't about who you loved, it was about how you loved. Be too passive or cross certain lines and you could lose your citizenship. And here's where I want to be really clear about something. I've been calling the Greeks gay, but that's not how they thought of themselves. Sexual orientation as identity, that's a more modern concept. For the Greeks, it was more about roles than categories. That doesn't mean they didn't feel something real. Take Sappho, for instance. She never called herself a lesbian, although the word comes from her home island, Lesbos. But her poems leave no doubt. She loved women, and she wrote about them with desire, depth, and heartbreak. She reminds us it wasn't about labels, it was about longing. So in Athens, being gay wasn't illegal, but it came with rules. You could desire, you could even act, but you had to keep your status, your role, your masculinity. If you took it, you were weak. If you gave it, you were still a man. It wasn't gay or straight, it just was. Now, if you want the real tea on Sappho, Plato, or Alexander the Great, Chris from This Week in Gay History has a killer companion video, and you can find the link in my pinned comment. Honestly, it's the perfect part 2. But even with the differences between the city-states, this was a generally more tolerant society than most of the world lives in now. The first hammer blow against this freer sexuality came from somewhere closer to home. But Rome didn't just borrow Greek ideas, they twisted them in ways we're still dealing with today. First, coming a bit later, they inherited a lot of Greek culture, whether that was eros or the Athenian anxieties about active and passive. But even there, they take it to another level. Emotional vulnerability was a good thing amongst the Greek states, but it was dangerous and effeminate for the Romans. Whereas Plato had talked about eros leading to wisdom, Romans like Juvenal made gay lovers seem immoral and indulgent, that it was a sign of social decay. And that gets to the heart of the Roman interpretation of eros. It didn't really matter who you wanted to have sex with, man or woman, whatever, but you better make sure that you're the dominant one. Sounds like certain toxic men on the internet now, right? To be a man in Rome was to dominate, not to desire. Greek eros had made love sacred. Roman power made it transactional. Vulnerability became shame, and that shift echoed across empires. The emotional bond of Greek eros was fading, and it laid the groundwork for an unstoppable force. Slowly but surely, early Christianity took root in the late Roman Empire. Its message? Depending on who you asked, the body was a source of temptation. The spirit must conquer it. And this is where Roman values meet Christian paranoia.
For Plato, desire might lead to truth. For Augustine, it led only to sin.
But it wasn't just gay impulses that were frowned upon. Pretty much everything that wasn't meant to produce children was a sin. Even then, it was a duty, not a pleasure. Over 1,000 years, these ideas were built on top of, and the Greek values were long forgotten. By the time the Roman Empire became Christian, the older, freer sexual norms had been overwritten, replaced by strict rules, shame, and sin. We've seen the seeds of how Europe became homophobic, but here we can see the final nail in the relatively free sexuality seen in pre-Christian societies all over the world, how our entire world became homophobic. With the Hijira people in India and Mahu in Hawaii or Fa'afine in Samoa, we see something beyond sexuality. We see a different type of freedom. A third gender that doesn't have to conform to rigid ideas of what a man or woman is. The Hijira were free, but were eventually outlawed by everyone's favourite empire, the British Empire, naturally, once it had control of India. There's also a lot of evidence of homosexuality all through Africa. Now, if an area as small as ancient Greece had lots of diversity and rules around being gay, you best believe the same applies to Africa too. But there is more than enough evidence of it definitely happening in places. And that if you were conquered by the British in particular, it was turned into a crime, just like it was in the mother country. That crime was sodomy, rooted in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah from the Bible. The colonial project did not just conquer bodies, it rewrote the boundaries of desire. And the saddest thing of all is that even when these empires had been kicked out or left, the lasting impact on the conquered cultures was that they had taken on their masters' views. They were now homophobic too. Even now you may hear that being gay is un-African, un-Indian, or sinful, when if anything, it's one of the most African, European, Indian, Asian, North or South American things to be. We just got groomed into thinking otherwise.
And it's at this point we can appreciate the Greeks for what they were. Sure, they weren't universally gay, but many of them were, and they didn't face homophobia as a result of it. That came much later. If only we could all live in a world that had that much liberty.
And there were so many individual stories that I didn't have time to get into today, but they are definitely worth checking out. If this video gave you the big picture, Chris is perfect for a deep dive. The names, the stories, the scandals, from Sappho to Plato to Alexander. Go check it out. It's basically the gay gossip column that you didn't know you needed. Don't let this history stay unheard.